what you're describing, spirituality, the science behind it, the neuroscience behind it, the importance of this specifically for mental health outcomes, the unmeasurable sense of the intervention of spirituality, where you can't even describe it. Like, you can't even describe what it is. You can, like you said, you can only measure, like, spirituality tendencies in people.
Lived human
spirituality. Sorry.
Yeah, that was right. We're on the same page.
Okay. All right, but it seems like it just butts heads with science.
Science can create a whole panoply of studies that together we can look at in aggregate and say, wow, okay, we know that a strong spiritual core is 4/5 protective against suicide. It's also 4/5 protective going through the window of risk against addiction, the trailhead of lifetime course. We can track neurocorrelates. We can, for instance, when it comes to developmental depression, look at people who have recovered from depression through a deepening of spiritual life, who have walked through developmental depression in the years of 16 through 26, ages 16 through 26, and say that, hey, how do they look different? And it turns out that people who have recovered from major depression through a strengthening of personal spirituality showed cortical thickness across regions of the parietal, precuneus, and occipital. Right. So, okay, we sent that off to JAMA Psychiatry, and what came back was, wow, interesting, we want you to run a follow-up analysis. How is a thick cortex across the regions of the awakened brain today predictive of how someone might be doing a year from now? And it turned out the cortical thickness across the regions of the awakened brain was prospectively protective against the level of depressive symptoms 1 year out. So there's some evidence that spiritual life that is strengthened and realized through despair, once set up, becomes a go-to place and is neuroprotective against depression down the road. That doesn't mean we never get depressed. It means that there's a spiritual response to suffering, and that our seat of perception and reflection is strengthened.
Yeah. You described our borderline obsession with the material, right? Not also materialism, but just the material, being able to, here it is, I can touch it, I can manipulate it, and therefore, I know that this is real. Yes. I always thought that came from science. That was something that just science, it was really super important to science, and then it got like extrapolated out to all sorts of elements of education. So because you mentioned it before, it's like this is kind of what butts heads with spirituality, is the fact that we can't do that.
So much is that in our culture that I think many people most equate science with radical materialism. But it turns out that science is a method. It's a method, and we can chart data points and then interpret what they mean, right? It is a lens, whether it's an MRI study or a genotyping study or an epidemiological study. Science is a lens. The interpretation of radical materialism, that it is only real if we can touch it, that there is no, when we showed the regions of cortical thickness associated with sustained spiritual life, there were people who said, oh, so the brain makes that up, right? There's just a hard stop, an absolute unwillingness to explore the range of possibility of a statement of the nature of reality, the ontology, the nature of reality other than only materialism. Well, that is not scientific. That is an assumption of materialism that is in the scientists. It is in the vogue, it is in the cultural moment of the scientists. And I actually think that it's part of an evisceration of meaning and despair that may have fallen out of World War II.
Interesting. Let me get your thoughts on that, buddy.
Well, I think that what I always have a challenge with when we talk about, the unquantifiable is you can never really dispute an interpretation. It's in the eyes of the beholder. I can interpret one finding one way, and you get 75 tweets going the other way, and so it's impossible to come together on an interpretation of quantifiable things in science. So what I always wonder when I read spiritual science or scientific evidence of spirituality is, what are the critics saying? It's not something that I've delved into, although I was pretty close I was trying to look at the placebo effect and the perception of control, which is not spirituality. It's just saying if you believe something, whether it's true or not, what happens to the brain? Where in the brain does that happen? How far down in sensory experience does it modify in physiology? How powerful is a belief? It was really what I wanted to look at. But I never made it down that road. I got, kind of waylaid in some synchronous event that we can talk about at some point. And, but it makes me think, like, what skepticism would I have come to? How would I have dealt with that? And so when I read your work and think about how far you've gone with it and how many people are following it and using it as guidance for their work or for their practice, what skepticism do you? I don't want to sit here and critique work. I'd have to, go through it with a fine-tooth comb and say something constructive and meaningful. But I'm just curious.
Welcome. The skeptic's important. The skeptic fuels the
Yeah.
internship.
I'm just curious. What have you come up
Yeah.
against, and how have you respond to that? How does it make you feel? And
So from scientists, good scientists, I've gotten almost no pushback. So the findings state what the findings state.
Yeah, sure.
Right. From people who never ever read the articles, and aren't scientists, there's all sorts of opinions. But so for instance, when we published in JAMA Psychiatry, the cortical thickness associated with sustained spiritual life, and in particular the strengthening of the brain in the regions that weren't thick but thin in people with recurrent major depression, suggesting developmental depression is our awakening and we're built for it, right? It went through 3 rounds of peer review, top scientists. Science put the good housekeeping seal on it. It's a good piece of science. There were 3,000 comments on, I think it was covered, it might have been the New York Times, it was something, right? And of the 3,000, I read as many as I could. I could only find 2 that had read the article.
It's classic.
But there was lots of opinion.
Yeah, of course.
Which is taste and appetite. I do think that at very least, when we have our findings, can we interpret the constellation of findings through the lens of multiple ontologies? From a view of radical materialism, we interpret the findings to mean the brain made this up. From the view of inherent transcendent quality in life, we interpret this to be the brain is connecting into the transcendent reality. Could there be, at very least, multiple ontologies used in the interpretation section, or at very least, a statement of the assumptive ontology in the scientist, that they are not more objective because they're radical materialists. They need to state their ontology. So that to me seems very fair and transparent.